The sky outside the small plane's window was a peaceful, empty blue. But inside, it was hell. The pilot was slumped over the controls, silent and still, his heart having given out moments before, and the plane, with no one at the controls, was now a metal coffin on a high-speed collision course with the earth below. Jacob knew he had only one impossible choice to make, because behind him, in a small crate, were 6 tiny lives. 6 little puppies who were the last living promise he had ever made to his wife. That terrible moment in the sky, the one that should have been the end of everything. It wasn't a curse. It turned out to be a blessing. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's start from the very beginning. The quiet in Jacob's house was a heavy, physical thing, a silence that had settled in the spaces where his wife Eleanor's voice used to be. His only defense against it was life, and life came in the form of 6 German Shepherd puppies. They were clumsy bundles of energy and sharp teeth, the final litter from a line of service dogs Eleanor had spent decades perfecting. They weren't just pets, they were her legacy, each one bred for courage and intelligence. Every time one of them tumbled over his worn leather boots, Jacob felt both a warmth in his chest and a familiar deep ache of loss. They were a living, breathing promise he had made to her. He remembered her hand in his, frail but firm, as she made him swear to see them through to their training. "They're born to save people, Jacob," she had whispered. Now, the moment had come to fulfill that promise. He picked up the phone to book their transport, and when the dispatcher asked for the destination, the word plane felt like a stone in his throat. Instantly, his mind flashed back to the roar of a C-130's engine, the icy rush of wind at 10,000 feet, and the heavy feeling of a mission gone wrong. His stomach dropped, the old fear as real and cold as it was 20 years ago. For a long moment, Jacob stood frozen, the phone receiver slick in his hand. The urge to hang up, to find another way, was overwhelming. He could drive, but it would take a week, and the specialized training center was expecting them. He looked over at the puppy pen, where one of the pups was determinedly trying to climb over its sleeping brother. He saw Eleanor's determined look in its eyes. The promise he made to her was a weight, but it was a warm weight, a connection to her he refused to break. Taking a deep breath, he spoke into the phone, his voice steadier than he felt. "Yes," he said, "I need to charter a small plane." Later that afternoon, he carefully prepared the large travel crate, lining it with soft blankets that still smelled faintly of Eleanor's laundry soap. He lifted each puppy in, speaking to them in a low, calm voice. "All right now, Eleanor's last soldiers," he murmured, a name he had given them in private. He checked their collars and made sure they had enough water for the flight. They were so small, yet he could already see the outlines of the powerful, loyal dogs they would become. In their trusting eyes, he saw not a burden, but a duty he was honored to carry. He locked the front door of the quiet house, the click of the deadbolt echoing in the silence. The drive to the small rural airfield was short, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the fields. He kept his eyes on the road, but he could feel the vast, open sky pressing down, a space he had once commanded, but now deeply distrusted. It was a place of bad memories, of falling too fast, of a life he couldn't save. As he pulled up to the gate, he glanced at the setting sun. For a moment, he felt a sudden, sharp coldness in the air, a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. At the small rural airfield, the plane was waiting. It was a single-engine Cessna, a reliable workhorse, not a military machine. The pilot, a friendly man in his 50s named George, shook Jacob's hand firmly and helped him load the crate of puppies into the small cabin. "They'll be fine back here," George said with a reassuring smile. "It's a smooth flight today." Jacob nodded, trying to match the pilot's easy confidence, but his hands felt cold as he buckled himself into the co-pilot's seat, the low hum of the instruments a familiar and unsettling sound. The takeoff was a low rumble that grew into a roar. The plane shivered as it gathered speed, and then, with a gentle lurch, they were airborne. Jacob's knuckles were white on his knees as he watched the ground fall away. He forced himself not to look down, focusing instead on the crate behind him. Through the wire mesh, he could see the puppies had curled into a single, sleeping pile, untroubled by the noise or the motion. Their complete trust was a small anchor in his storm of anxiety, and slowly, the tightness in his chest began to ease. They had been in the air for nearly an hour, cruising over an endless carpet of dense green forest. George was telling a story about a fishing trip when he suddenly stopped mid-sentence. He made a small gasping sound, his hand flying to his chest. His eyes went wide with a silent, shocking pain. Before Jacob could even process what was happening, George slumped forward, his body limp against the controls. The sudden silence in the cabin was broken only by the steady drone of the engine. The plane's nose dipped sharply, and for a terrifying second, they were falling. The puppies yelped in alarm as the crate slid against the cabin wall. Then, with a mechanical whir, the autopilot corrected the descent, leveling the plane out. They were flying straight and level again, but it was no comfort. They were now a ghost ship, flying on a set course toward nowhere, piloted by a man who would never wake up. The view outside, once a beautiful landscape, now looked like a vast, empty prison with no walls and no floor. Panic seized Jacob. He unbuckled himself and checked the pilot. There was no pulse. He fumbled with the radio, shouting their position, but the only reply was the crackle of static. His training kicked in, and his eyes scanned the instrument panel for options, for anything that could help. His gaze fell on the fuel gauge. The needle was just below the halfway mark, a silent, steady countdown to an inevitable crash. As the full weight of their hopeless situation crashed down on him, his frantic eyes darted around the cabin. Then he saw it. Tucked behind the pilot's seat, a flash of red canvas and black straps. An emergency parachute pack. It wasn't a solution. It was a single, terrifying question hanging in the air. The cold shock of the air was absolute. For a terrifying moment, Jacob was just a man in a storm of noise and falling chaos. Then, a sharp, frightened yelp came from the bag on his chest, a tiny sound nearly lost in the wind's roar. It cut through his panic like a signal flare, grounding him instantly. The fear was still there, but it was now a tool, not a cage. He was no longer a victim falling from the sky. He was a rescuer on a mission, and his mission was to get his precious cargo to the ground safely. His eyes, now sharp with purpose, scanned the cabin one last time before it disappeared above him. He had already seen the emergency parachute pack, but now he saw it differently. It wasn't just a chance for one person to live, it was a vehicle. Decades of training, long buried under grief and quiet routine, surged to the surface. His mind became a place of cold calculation. He knew the risk was enormous, the odds impossibly long. But the image of Eleanor's face, trusting and hopeful, burned away any hesitation. This was not a choice, it was a command he had to obey. Inside the rattling cabin, he had worked with a speed he thought he'd lost forever. He'd found a canvas duffel bag, ripped his own jacket from his back, and lined the bag with it to create a padded nest. One by one, he had gently but quickly placed the 6 whimpering puppies inside. They were scared, but they huddled together, their small bodies a warm, living weight. He zipped the bag most of the way, leaving just enough of an opening for air, his movements precise and economical, wasting no time and no motion. He had struggled into the parachute harness, his fingers surprisingly steady as he pulled the straps tight and buckled them into place. Then he lifted the duffel bag. It was heavier now, filled with the responsibility of 6 lives and one unbreakable promise. He carefully secured the bag to the front of the harness, making it a part of him. They would make this journey together. The puppies were quiet now, as if they understood that their survival depended on their stillness. His final act on the plane was a battle of will against physics. He threw his shoulder against the cabin door, the wind trying to force it shut. With a groan of protesting metal and a surge of adrenaline, the door flew open, revealing the dizzying emptiness below. He stood on the threshold, the wind tearing at him, the world a blur of green. He didn't look down at the ground. He looked at the bag on his chest, whispered a silent prayer to his wife, and launched himself into the void. The fall was a violent rush of sensation, ending with the brutal, life-saving jolt of the parachute opening. The canopy caught the wind, and the world below stopped tumbling and began to swing in a slow, silent rhythm. He aimed for a patch of dense trees, knowing a soft landing was impossible, but that branches might break his fall. He was right. He crashed through a thick pine, the impact sending a blinding flash of pain up his right leg before he hit the forest floor with a heavy thud. For a long moment he lay there, gasping for air, the only sound the gentle rustle of the parachute settling over him. Ignoring the fire in his leg, he pushed himself up. Pain was a familiar old friend. It could wait. With shaking hands, he unstrapped the duffel bag and tore it open. Inside, a tangle of fur and wide, terrified eyes stared back at him. He carefully checked each puppy, his rough hands surprisingly gentle. They were scared and bruised, but they were whole. They were alive. A wave of profound relief washed over him, so strong it nearly buckled his good leg. The first part of the mission was complete. But as the sun began to sink below the horizon, a new, more insidious enemy appeared: the cold. The temperature was dropping fast, and the puppies, with their thin coats, were already shivering. His survival training, locked away for 20 years, came back with startling clarity. He scanned his surroundings, his eyes assessing the landscape for resources. He spotted a cluster of low-hanging fir trees, their branches thick enough to offer some protection from the wind. Using a sturdy branch as a crutch, he began to limp towards it. Within the shelter of the dense firs, he worked with grim determination. He snapped off dead branches and wove them into the existing foliage, creating a small, crude lean-to. He took his jacket from the duffel bag and spread it on the ground, creating an insulated floor. One by one, he placed the puppies on the familiar fabric, and they immediately huddled together for warmth. Finally, as darkness enveloped the forest, Jacob crawled into the cramped space beside them, pulling a large branch over the entrance to block the wind. Later that night, the forest was a symphony of unfamiliar sounds, but Jacob heard only the quiet rhythm of breathing beside him. 6 small heartbeats pulsed against his side, a steady, living warmth in the vast, cold darkness. He was no longer just a man who had fallen from the sky. He was the center of a tiny, fragile universe. He had saved them from the fall, but as he listened to a distant howl, he wondered if he had only delivered them to a slower, colder end. At first light, a desperate thirst drove Jacob from the shelter. Leaning heavily on a thick branch, every step sent a jolt of agony up his injured leg. But the thought of the puppy's own thirst was a stronger motivator than his pain. He followed the slope of the land until the quiet sound of moving water reached his ears. It was a small, clear stream, the water so cold it made his teeth ache. He cupped his hands, drinking deeply, before carefully bringing each puppy to the water's edge to let them drink their fill. It was a small victory, a temporary reprieve against the vast indifference of the forest. The second day was harder. The relief of finding water was replaced by the gnawing, hollow ache of hunger. Jacob had no tools, no weapon, and no real knowledge of foraging. He was a man trained to save people from disasters, not to live off the land. His energy dwindled with every passing hour. The forest, which had seemed like a potential lifeline, now felt like a green cage, its silence broken only by the rustle of animals he could hear but never see. Despair began to creep in at the edges of his resolve, cold and persistent. The puppies seemed to sense his fading hope. Whenever he would sit down to rest, exhausted and defeated, they would abandon their playful wrestling and gather around him. They would press their small, warm bodies against his legs and chest, one of them occasionally reaching up to lick his hand. They were not just depending on him for survival. They were offering comfort, a silent, instinctual form of support. In their simple, unwavering presence, Jacob found a small flicker of strength to keep going, a reason to fight the encroaching darkness. By the morning of the third day, that flicker had nearly died out. A cold rain had soaked them during the night, and Jacob's body ached with a deep, bone-weary cold. He lay under the shelter, barely moving, the pain in his leg, a constant, throbbing drum. He was failing. He had saved them from the fall, only to lead them to a slow, starving end. He thought of Eleanor, of his promise, and for the first time, he felt the crushing weight of his own failure. He closed his eyes, a wave of exhaustion washing over him. Suddenly, a single, sharp bark cut through the quiet despair. It was the boldest of the litter, the one who always led the others in play. He stood at the entrance of the shelter, his small body rigid, and barked again, not a yelp of fear, but a clear, loud call into the forest. Jacob weakly tried to quiet him, to conserve what little energy they all had left, but the puppy was resolute. He was not just making noise, he was sending a signal. The puppy's relentless barking was a challenge to the crushing silence of the woods. It was a deliberate, determined announcement. We are here. He would bark, then listen, his head cocked, before barking again. It was as if some deep, ancestral instinct had taken over, a knowledge that survival sometimes depended not on hiding, but on being found. Jacob watched him, a sliver of awe cutting through his exhaustion. This tiny creature was fighting back with the only weapon he had. Inspired by their brother's courage, one by one, the other puppies joined in. Soon, the small shelter was filled with a chorus of determined barks. It was a chaotic, desperate sound, but it was the sound of life, of a refusal to give up. The 6 puppies, his last soldiers, were making their final stand. Their combined voices echoed through the trees, a fragile beacon of hope sent out into the vast, lonely wilderness, praying that someone, anyone, would hear. Miles away, an old forester named Silas was making his routine patrol along a ridge. He knew the sounds of this forest as well as he knew his own heartbeat, the cry of a hawk, the rustle of a deer. But this sound was different. It was the persistent, rhythmic barking of dogs, too organized for coyotes, too stationary for a hunter. It was a sound that didn't belong, an anomaly in the day's normal symphony. It was a question that needed an answer. Intrigued and a little concerned, Silas turned from his familiar path and headed down into the valley, moving toward the sound. He walked with the quiet, steady pace of a man who had spent a lifetime in the woods, his eyes scanning the ground for tracks, his ears pinpointing the source of the barking. As he drew closer, the sound became more distinct. It wasn't one dog, but several, their voices blending together in a desperate, urgent chorus. His curiosity turned into a feeling of professional duty. Something was wrong. He parted a thick curtain of ferns and stopped dead. The scene before him was surreal. In a crude shelter of branches sat an old man, pale and unmoving, his leg clearly injured. Surrounding him, like a loyal guard, were 6 German Shepherd puppies. At the sight of Silas, they stopped barking and stood their ground, a low growl rumbling in the chest of the boldest pup. Silas saw it all in a single glance: the makeshift camp, the exhaustion on the man's face, the fierce protective loyalty of the animals. "Easy now," Silas said, his voice calm and slow, showing his empty hands. The puppies watched his every move as he cautiously approached. He knelt beside Jacob, who was barely conscious, and saw the signs of severe dehydration and exposure. Pulling a thick wool blanket from his pack, he gently covered the old man. Then he uncapped his canteen and helped Jacob take a few small sips of water before getting on his radio. "This is Silas at Grid 7B, he said, his voice now stripped of its calm, replaced with urgency. "I found him. I need a medical evac, now." The distant chop of helicopter blades grew into a deafening roar that sent birds scattering from the trees. A medic was lowered on a winch into the small clearing, his movements swift and efficient. He quickly assessed Jacob, preparing the stretcher and an IV drip. The noise was terrifying, the wind from the rotors, a violent storm, but the puppies stayed close to Jacob, refusing to abandon their post. As the medics began to lift the stretcher, Jacob's eyes fluttered open. His voice was a dry, weak rasp, but his words were clear. "The puppies," he insisted, his hand gesturing feebly toward the duffel bag he had never let go of. "They have to go too." The medic, seeing the unbreakable will in the old man's eyes, didn't argue. He nodded to his partner, and they carefully loaded the puppies into the bag before securing Jacob to the stretcher. His promise would be honored. Suspended between the sky and the trees, Jacob felt the winch lift him away from the forest floor. He was wrapped in a warm blanket, the medic speaking to him in a reassuring voice. Below, the endless canopy of green that had been his prison for 3 days became just a pattern on the landscape. He looked at the bag carrying the puppies, safe beside him, and finally allowed himself to believe it was over. They had made it. But as the adrenaline gave way to exhaustion, a hollow feeling began to form. The mission was complete. What was left for him now but the quiet, empty house he had left behind? Jacob woke to the clean, antiseptic smell of a hospital and the steady beep of a machine beside his bed. His leg was in a cast, but the throbbing pain had been replaced by a dull ache. A friendly nurse told him his story was on the front page of the local newspaper, the headline calling him the guardian angel of the sky. He was a local hero, a title that felt strange and uncomfortable, as if it belonged to the younger man he used to be, not the quiet widower who had simply tried to keep a promise. He just felt tired and profoundly grateful to be alive. Over the next 2 days, his room was filled with visitors. The families who were meant to receive the puppies came, their faces a mixture of awe and overwhelming gratitude. They brought flowers and cards, but mostly they brought their thanks, their voices thick with emotion as they looked at the man who had risked everything for the animals they already loved. Jacob, a man unused to praise, simply nodded and listened, feeling a warmth spread through him that had nothing to do with the hospital blankets. He was seeing the end of Eleanor's story, and it was beautiful. On the 3rd day, A man in a crisp professional jacket came to his room. He introduced himself as Mr. Davies, the director of the Canine Training Center. He was polite and serious, his demeanor a stark contrast to the emotional families. He didn't offer praise or thanks, but instead observed Jacob with a thoughtful, analytical gaze. Jacob felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. He worried there was some rule he had broken, some protocol that his desperate act had violated. Davies was here for business, not sentiment. After a moment of silence, Mr. Davies spoke. "The 6 puppies are in perfect health," he stated, his voice even. "They are remarkable. A bloodline like theirs is rare, but their story, what they survived with you, that makes them priceless." He looked directly at Jacob. "An animal that survives an ordeal like that alongside a human develops a unique bond. And the human who leads them through it possesses a spirit of command and trust that cannot be taught." He wasn't just talking about the puppies, he was talking about Jacob. "Our center trains dogs to save lives, Mr. Trains," Davies continued, leaning forward slightly. "But we also need to train the people who handle them. We need someone to teach them not just commands, but instinct. To teach them about the bond you clearly understand better than anyone." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "I'm not here to take the puppies, Mr. Evans. I'm here to ask you to come with them, to be an honorary mentor at our facility." The offer was so unexpected it left Jacob speechless. His first instinct was to refuse. His life was his quiet house, his memories. He was too old to start something new. "I'm not a teacher," he said, his voice barely a whisper. But as he spoke, he glanced out the window of his room. Down on the hospital lawn, a nurse was playing with the puppies. They were a whirlwind of joyful energy, strong and confident. Seeing them, so full of life and purpose, he felt a pull, a sense of a story that wasn't quite over yet. 6 months later, Jacob stood on the edge of a vast training field, leaning lightly on a cane. The puppies were puppies no longer. They were magnificent young dogs, their movements filled with power and grace as they ran through obstacle courses. He had accepted the offer, moving into a small cottage on the center's grounds. He wasn't a formal instructor, but a guide, a living legend who taught the new recruits about trust. He watched them all, but his eyes always came back to Rex, the bold one. He saw an intensity in that dog, a quiet focus that seemed to perceive things the others missed, and it stirred a feeling in him he couldn't quite name. A year passed. The Sky Six, as they were affectionately known, had become the heart of the training center, and Jacob its soul. He didn't teach from a textbook. He taught by walking the fields with the handlers and their dogs, sharing quiet observations that were worth more than any lecture. His quiet house was no longer empty. It was a home again. The ache of Eleanor's loss had softened, replaced by a sense of continuing purpose. He had fulfilled his promise, and in doing so, had found an unexpected new life. The call came on a crisp autumn afternoon, cutting through the calm routine of the center. An experienced hiker had gone missing in the nearby national park. He was overdue by 24 hours, and a storm was predicted to roll in by morning. The local search and rescue team was stretched thin, and they were officially requesting the aid of Jacob's unit for the first time. The energy at the center shifted instantly from training to action. This was no simulation. This was real. At the base of the mountain trail, the scene was a controlled chaos of police cruisers and emergency vehicles. The search leader, a man named Captain Riley, was all business, his face grim as he pointed to a map spread across the hood of his truck. He valued facts, GPS coordinates, and clear lines of authority. He gave Jacob and his team a curt nod, his expression making it clear he saw them as a novel but unproven asset. His last known position was near this ridge, Riley said, his finger tapping the map. Let's stick to the grid. The primary clue was a backpack found by the initial search party at the head of a treacherous trail. It was confirmed to belong to the missing hiker, Daniel Porter. It was the obvious starting point, the place where his scent would be strongest. The air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth, a complex tapestry of scents for any dog to unravel. Riley watched with an impatient, skeptical eye as the handlers brought their dogs forward. As instructed, the handlers presented an item from the backpack to their dogs. The effect was immediate. 5 of the German shepherds, Bella, Chief, Luna, Duke, and Storm, caught the scent and became instantly alert, their bodies straining forward, eager to begin the hunt. Their training took over, and they were ready to follow the trail up the steep, rocky path, exactly as the search plan dictated. To Captain Riley and his team, everything was proceeding by the book. The scene was set for a classic search and rescue mission. The clues were clear, the dogs were eager, and the path seemed obvious. The team was a well-oiled machine, ready to deploy. The 5 handlers gave their dogs the signal, and they began moving up the trail, their noses to the ground, following the scent trail left by the missing hiker hours before. Their confidence was high. It was only a matter of time. But Jacob wasn't watching them. His gaze was fixed on Rex, the best and most perceptive of the 6. Rex stood perfectly still, a few feet away from the backpack. He had sniffed the air once, then completely ignored the item offered to him. His body was rigid, his head cocked, and his intelligent eyes were focused not on the trail ahead, but on the dense, untracked wilderness to his left. He wasn't following. He was listening to something else entirely, and a cold knot of uncertainty began to form in Jacob's stomach. Jacob walked over to Rex, the dog's stillness, a stark contrast to the focused energy of the other 5 disappearing up the trail. "What is it, boy?" he murmured, running a hand down the dog's powerful back. He tried again, holding a glove from the hiker's backpack near Rex's nose. The dog turned his head away, giving a low, frustrated whine deep in his throat. It wasn't a refusal of the command, it was a clear, insistent correction. The trail, he seemed to be saying, was the wrong way. Captain Riley noticed the delay and strode back down the path, his boots crunching impatiently on the gravel. "What's the problem, Evans? Is your dog malfunctioning?" The question was sharp, laced with the skepticism of a man who trusted technology over instinct. He saw a dog failing to perform a basic task, a broken piece of equipment holding up a critical operation. Riley was a man who saw the world in straight lines, and Rex was trying to draw a curve. Rex ignored the captain completely. He took a few steps away from the trail, toward the dense, pathless woods, and let out a single, sharp bark. Then he turned his head and looked directly at Jacob, his eyes intelligent and questioning. It was the same look he had given him in the dark, cold forest a year ago, a look of unwavering certainty. In that moment, the rest of the world faded away. There was no search team, no impatient captain, only the silent, powerful communication between a man and a dog bound by a shared miracle. The rest of the team was already 100 yards up the trail, a disciplined line moving into the wilderness. Jacob looked at their retreating forms, then back at Rex, who stood firm, a living compass pointing away from the obvious path. He remembered the feeling in the falling plane, the moment he chose to trust something beyond reason. He had to make that choice again. "He's got something," Jacob said to Riley, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm going to follow him." Captain Riley scoffed, shaking his head in disbelief. "We have a scent trail, Evans. A confirmed location. You're going on a wild goose chase based on a dog's whim?" He gestured angrily up the mountain. "That's the mission. You're either with us or you're not." For a man like Riley, deviating from the plan was not just inefficient, it was a form of insubordination. He saw Jacob's choice as a foolish, sentimental indulgence that was putting a life at risk. Jacob felt the weight of every eye on him. To follow Rex was to publicly defy a direct order, to choose faith over fact. He looked at the trail where the others had gone, the logical, approved path. Then he looked at Rex, who was patiently waiting, his entire being focused on the secret the forest held. Jacob took a deep breath. "He saved my life, Captain," he said, not as an excuse, but as a statement of fact. "I've learned to trust him." He unclipped Rex's leash from his belt, a symbolic act of severing ties with the main group. "All right, boy, lead on," he said softly. Rex didn't hesitate. He plunged into the thick underbrush, moving with a confidence that belied the lack of a path. Jacob adjusted his pack, gave Captain Riley one last, steady look, and followed his dog into the woods. He was alone again, breaking the rules, guided by nothing more than the instinct of an animal he had once carried in a duffel bag. The forest floor was a tangle of roots and fallen branches, a world away from the cleared trail. Rex moved through it with a singular purpose, his nose sometimes to the ground, sometimes sampling the air. He wasn't tracking a continuous scent, Jacob realized. He was moving from one faint scent pool to another, like a mariner navigating by distant stars. This wasn't the scent of a lost hiker. It was the scent of someone trying very hard not to be found. After nearly an hour of hard walking, they broke through the trees into a small, hidden clearing. In the center stood an old, dilapidated hunter's cabin, its windows dark and empty, its roof sagging under the weight of years of snow. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades, a forgotten relic of a bygone era. It was the last place a hiker, even a lost one, would have any reason to be. As Jacob cautiously approached, Rex didn't try to go inside. Instead, he circled the cabin, his behavior methodical and precise. He was examining the perimeter, his nose twitching as he processed the information left in the air and on the ground. Jacob followed, his own senses on high alert. He trusted Rex to find the scent, but he trusted his own eyes to find the story. The cabin felt wrong, a silent stage for a play that had already ended. Jacob began his own search, his eyes scanning for details the average person would miss. He ran his hand along the rough-hewn doorframe, and his fingers snagged on something. He looked closer. It was a fresh splinter of wood, the inner part of the scratch, a lighter color than the weathered gray exterior. It was a small, almost invisible detail, but it was a clear sign that the door had been forced open, and recently. Someone had been here. While Jacob examined the door, Rex began to dig frantically at the base of a loose rock near the cabin's foundation. He was whining, a low, urgent sound of discovery. Jacob limped over and pushed the rock aside. Underneath, nestled in the damp earth, was a small, tarnished piece of metal. He picked it up and wiped the dirt away. It was a money clip, engraved with the initials D.P. Daniel Porter, the missing hiker. The pieces clicked into place with a sudden, chilling clarity. The forced entry, the hidden money clip, the dog's refusal to follow the main trail. Porter hadn't gotten lost on that mountain. He had come to this cabin for a reason, and something had gone wrong. Rex hadn't been tracking a lost man. He had been tracking a man running from something, a man leaving a trail of fear. Jacob stood up, the money clip cold in his hand. He looked back in the direction they had come, toward the mountain where the rest of the team was searching in vain. They were looking for a victim, but Rex had found a scene, and as Jacob looked at the dark, silent cabin, he knew the real story of what happened to Daniel Porter wasn't up on that trail. It had started, and perhaps ended, right here. The question was no longer, where is he? The question was, what was he doing here? Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the smell of dust and decay. Rotting furniture lay in disarray, covered in a fine layer of grime. Despite the clutter of overturned crates and torn sacks, Rex paid it no mind. He walked with a confident stride directly to a large, moldering armchair that was leaking its stuffing onto the floor. It was the most unassuming object in the room, yet the dog treated it as the absolute center of the scene. He didn't circle it or sniff it idly. Instead, he began to whine, a low, urgent sound, and started scratching at the grimy floorboards right beside the chair's rotted leg. His paws scraped against the old wood with a focused intensity that made it clear he was trying to signal something specific was underneath. Jacob watched, his mind racing. This was not random behavior, it was a pinpoint designation. Jacob's first logical thought was a mouse or some other small animal nesting under the floor. Any other dog might be distracted by such a thing, but he knew Rex's signals. This wasn't the high-energy excitement of prey drive with its playful nips and wagging tail. This was the specific, low-frequency alert he had been trained to recognize, the same focus he would use to indicate a person buried under snow. Trusting the dog over his own logic, Jacob got down on his hands and knees, the damp wood cold against his skin. He ran his hand over the boards where Rex had been scratching, feeling for a loose edge or a hidden latch. His eyes swept the floor, trying to see what the dog could so clearly smell. Then, in a thin shaft of light filtering through a grimy window, he saw it. A tiny, almost invisible glint of light against the dark wood. He carefully picked it up. It wasn't a piece of metal or a dropped coin. It was a small, curved shard of glass, scratched and dirty, no bigger than his thumbnail. He held it up to the light, turning it over in his fingers. He recognized the slight curvature immediately. It was from the face of a wristwatch, the kind a man like Daniel Porter, an avid outdoorsman, would wear. The pieces clicked into place with the cold finality of a closing lock, the fresh scratch on the door frame, the money clip hidden hastily under a rock, and now a shattered watch face found on the floor. These weren't the signs of a man who got lost while enjoying nature. These were the signs of a struggle, of a frantic, violent encounter that had happened right here in this forgotten cabin. Jacob looked at Rex, who sat watching him, panting softly, his job done. The old man felt a profound sense of awe for the animal before him. He reached out and placed a hand on the dog's head. "You didn't smell him at all, did you, boy?" he whispered, his voice full of wonder. "You smelled the lie." But if Porter hadn't gotten lost, then what had really happened here, and where was he now? With this new understanding, Jacob didn't lead Rex back out the front door. He was no longer looking for the trail of a lost hiker. He was looking for the trail of a fugitive or a victim. "Okay, Rex," he said quietly. "Show me the way out." He let the dog lead him to the back of the cabin, where a single, small window had been broken from the inside, a clear path of escape. Rex slipped through the opening and immediately started moving downhill, away from the mountain ridge where the rest of the team was still searching. Every instinct of a search and rescue operation screamed that this was wrong. A person fleeing in the wilderness would seek high ground for visibility, but Rex moved with unwavering confidence, and Jacob followed without question. his trust in the dog now absolute. The dog led him not through open woods, but along the ghost of a trail so overgrown with ferns and young saplings that it was nearly invisible to a human eye. It was a path that had been intentionally forgotten, reclaimed by nature. This was a route someone would use if their primary goal was to avoid being seen, to vanish completely from the known network of trails. Jacob stopped, his eyes catching a faint impression in a patch of damp earth. He knelt down, his bad leg protesting. It was a partial footprint, shallow and indistinct, but one detail was perfectly clear. The sole was smooth, without the deep treads of a hiking boot. It was the mark of a city shoe, completely out of place in this rugged terrain. It was another piece of the lie, undeniable proof that Porter never intended to go for a hike. The theory was now a certainty in Jacob's mind. The backpack left at the trailhead was a deliberate misdirection, a carefully placed prop in a staged disappearance. The real story hadn't started on that mountain trail. It had started here, in the shadows, on a path designed to lead away from prying eyes. Every step they took led them further from the search grid and deeper into the truth. After another 20 minutes, the overgrown path suddenly opened up, ending at the edge of an old, abandoned logging road. The road was little more than 2 gravel ruts disappearing into the trees in both directions, but it was a clear connection to the outside world. It was a place where a car could have been waiting. Rex walked to the edge of the road, sniffed the air one last time, and then sat. He looked up at Jacob and let out a single, sharp bark. It was his trained signal for end of trail. His part of the job was over. He had followed the scent of the lie to its conclusion. Jacob now stood on the edge of the empty road, the silence of the forest pressing in on him. He had found the escape route, but the man was gone, and the trail was now cold. Jacob knew he had to act, but his small radio had poor reception, this deep in the valley. He stood on the logging road, a place of silent endings, and knew that shouting into the static would be useless. He had to trust that his discovery would mean something when it was finally heard. He took a deep breath, picturing the map in his head, estimating his position relative to the main search area. "Captain Riley, this is Jacob Evans," he said, his voice calm and steady despite the urgency he felt. "Do you copy?" The radio crackled back, Riley's voice faint but clear, laced with annoyance. "Evans, what is it? We're in the middle of a grid search up here." Jacob ignored the captain's tone. He didn't have time for protocol. "Your missing hiker was never on that trail, Captain," he stated simply. "The backpack was a decoy. I'm at an abandoned logging road, grid reference approximately 9 Delta. The trail ends here." He was met by a vehicle. There was a moment of dead silence on the other end of the radio. Jacob could picture Riley's disbelief, the conflict between procedure and this unbelievable new information. "A decoy?" Riley's voice came back, stripped of its earlier arrogance, replaced by confusion. "What are you talking about?" Jacob quickly laid out the evidence: the forced cabin, the money clip, the shattered watch, the city shoe print. He wasn't offering a theory, he was presenting a case. As he finished, another voice cut in on the channel, this one belonging to the local sheriff who was coordinating from the command post. "Hold your position, Mr. Evans," the sheriff said, his tone serious and immediate. "We've been running Porter's name. Turns out he's a key witness in a major fraud case. He was scheduled to testify tomorrow." Suddenly, everything made a horrifying kind of sense. Daniel Porter hadn't run away. He had been taken. The forest, which had felt like a neutral space, now seemed menacing. Jacob was no longer a rescuer. He was a witness standing at a crime scene. He scanned the trees, a cold feeling prickling his skin. How long ago had they been here? Were they still close? He put a hand on Rex's head, the dog's solid presence, a small comfort in the suddenly dangerous silence. The wait felt like an eternity. Jacob and Rex sat at the edge of the road, two solitary figures in the vast wilderness. The afternoon sun began to dip lower, casting long, eerie shadows through the trees. Jacob kept his ears open, listening for any sound that was out of place. He was no longer just a dog handler. He was a sentry, guarding the last known location of a man whose life was in grave danger. Finally, he heard it. The distant but growing sound of sirens, their cry echoing strangely in the valley. A few minutes later, two sheriff's department vehicles came bouncing down the rough logging road, their lights flashing. The deputies emerged, their faces grim, and immediately began securing the area. Captain Riley arrived shortly after, his expression a mixture of shock and a newfound, grudging respect. He walked over to Jacob. "You were right," he said, the words costing him a visible effort. "How did your dog know?" Jacob simply looked down at Rex. "He didn't know," he replied. "He just knew what was true. The news of the kidnapping and Rex's incredible role in uncovering it turned the training center into a hub of media attention. Cameras and reporters lined the fences, all hoping for a glimpse of the miracle dog. But inside, the atmosphere was one of quiet pride and relief. The authorities, using the information from the cabin, had managed to track down the kidnappers and rescue Daniel Porter, who was shaken but unharmed. Rex hadn't just found a trail, he had saved a man's life. A few days later, Captain Riley made a special trip to the center. He didn't come in his official capacity, but as a man humbled by what he had witnessed. He found Jacob by the training field, watching a new class of recruits. He didn't offer a formal apology, but instead walked over to Rex, knelt down, and simply stroked the dog's head. "I've worked in SAR for 20 years, Riley said, looking up at Jacob. "I thought I knew everything about tracking. That dog taught me I know nothing about the truth." That evening, Jacob stood before the class of new handlers. They were young, eager, and full of the technical knowledge they had learned from books and lectures. They looked at him with a new level of reverence. He was no longer just the old man with the amazing backstory. He was the keeper of a profound wisdom they were all desperate to understand. He didn't talk about scent cones or grid patterns. He told them the story of that day, from the moment Rex refused to follow the trail to the silence of the empty logging road. He spoke not of his own cleverness, but of his decision to listen, to set aside his own ego and trust the animal beside him. He wanted them to understand that the leash in their hands was not just a tool for control, but a line of communication. "Your books will teach you how to read a map," he told them, his voice filling the quiet room. "Your instructors will teach you how to follow a trail. That's the science of the job. But your dog," he paused, letting his gaze fall on each of them, "your dog will teach you how to read the silence, how to find the truth when all the facts are telling you a lie. That's the art of it." His final words hung in the air, a lesson far more valuable than any technical skill. He was teaching them that the bond between a handler and their dog was not one of master and servant, but of partners. True partnership, he explained, was not about giving commands. It was about learning to listen to a language that had no words, a language of pure, unvarnished instinct. As the sun set over the training field, Jacob walked back to his cottage, Rex trotting faithfully by his side. The dog was a hero, but he didn't know it. He was simply a good dog who trusted his man. Jacob looked down at him, his heart full. They were an unlikely pair. An old man with a painful past and a dog born in a falling plane. Together, they had learned the most important lesson of all, that the deepest truths are not seen with the eyes, but are felt silently at the other end of the leash. This is the end of the story. Thank you for listening. If you liked the story, please consider liking and subscribing to my humble channel. And if you propose an idea for the next story that you want to hear in comments, I just may do it.